Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's McDonald-Laurier Institute webinar entitled Delayed and Denied, the Challenges Faced by Canadians with Rare Disorders Due to Ill-Advised Drug Policies. My name is Aaron Woodrick. I'm the Director of the Domestic Policy Program here at MLI. Very pleased to be moderating today's discussion, which I'm sure will prove to be a very interesting one. Our panelists today, we have two of them, are Nigel Rawson, who's a Senior Fellow with us here at MLI, as well as an Affiliate Scholar with the Canadian Health Policy Institute, as well as John Adams, also a Senior Fellow here with MLI. We've got an all MLI cast today, who is not just a Senior Fellow, but also co-founder and CEO of Canadian PKU and Allied Disorders. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting us.
You're very welcome. Just to let the audience know the way we're going to proceed today, we have a short slide presentation that Nigel is going to lead us through. Then we're going to move into a discussion. And for those of you as well who are joining us on YouTube or other platforms, you can ask questions. So feel free to submit questions through the appropriate comment or chat box, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Nigel, to start the slideshow.
Okay. Let's see the first slide. So, well, that's the title. So next slide, please. So these are our disclosures. I'm not going to read them all out, but we've received some money from various sources over the past 3 years. I don't think they particularly conflict with our presentation, although they probably add to it, in fact. Next slide, please. So, I think you're missing a slide, but our processes in Canada for getting drugs to patients is quite complex. It takes quite a long time to develop a new drug, as you can see here. First has to go to Health Canada for their approval, then to Health Technology Assessment, of which we have two organizations in Canada, one for Quebec, one for the rest of Canada. Then the drug is invited commonly into the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which is the body that negotiates prices on behalf of the public drug plans. Once a drug has received a positive negotiation there, then it's up to the public drug plans, and the time taken for those public drug plans to get them on their formularies is highly variable. Kind of overseeing all this is the Patent Medicine Prices Review Board. We do like complex titles in Canada. And that really starts once a new patented drug has been first sold in Canada. Let's have a look at those individual organizations. Next slide, please. So the federal regulatory approval is by Health Canada. It considers safety, efficacy, and quality of production. Traditionally, it's thought of as being slow compared with the United States and Europe. Forgive my frog. And that's partly because it has smaller human financial resources. But over the last decade or so, it's been reasonably consistent in the amount of time it takes them to do their job with the United States and Europe. But the point is that submissions come to Health Canada generally about 12 months after going to America or the European Union. There is a solution. It would be to accept evaluations from one of those two trusted, maybe both of those regulators, instead of reinventing the wheel. But in terms of drugs for rare disorders, or orphan drugs, whichever you want to call them, there's a lack of incentives to, in fact, bring those innovations of medicine, those innovative medicines to Canada. And we can talk a bit about that later. Next slide. So the health technology assessment processes, as I said, INES for Quebec, CADTH for the rest of Canada. I'm going to focus mostly on CADTH because I'm not so familiar with INES. But they both consider what we call cost effectiveness, have some reservations around that. That's why there's a quotes around that. CADTH has one process for cancer drugs, another for all other drugs. And there are differences between how those processes work. There's reimbursement recommendations to the government drug plans about whether they should be funded. It takes some time to do that. I looked at the 619 recommendations published over the 10 years between 2014 and 2023, and the average time was 238 days. That's almost 8 months. So 2 months over their purported target, and only 12 above 6 months. So only 12, just over 12% are within 6 months. So Cadith fails this target times. It also has a low cost effectiveness threshold, which I didn't really get into here, but it has a number of reservations about that. It's not really accountable to patients, in my opinion, and certainly there's a lack of transparency. Next slide. So the PCPA, or the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, it's the federal, provincial, territorial government's organization to negotiate prices of new and existing drugs. So I'm going to focus on new drugs here and today on behalf of all 14 governments. And there's many different drug plans. There's an awful lot of them. And so they negotiate with pharmaceutical manufacturers. In 2023, it was reorganized as a non-profit corporation, as Cadith is. The objectives here are listed here, but basically it's to try to get increase access to treatments, to lower drug prices, and to improve consistency across the jurisdictions. It takes quite a bit of time to decide whether to negotiate, even for those drugs that receive a pretty positive reimbursement recommendation, and it then takes more time to negotiate. It unfortunately fails a lot of those target times, and there's a lack of transparency. Obviously, agreements are confidential between businesses and the PCPA by agreement, but there's not a lot of other transparency around, for example, issues around why drugs didn't get a negotiation. Next slide. So, as we know, there's many government drug plans. They're mostly for seniors, social assistance recipients, and some special groups. They offer a coverage to about a third of Canadians, according to the Conference Board of Canada. It is clear that some individuals, in fact, don't enroll. Private plans cover about 2/3 of Canadians through employment, associations, and so forth. And family members have that membership, so families have the insurance too. Decisions to reimburse are based on the jurisdiction's priorities, its budget, and of course the HTA and PCPA results. Each plan has a complex system of deductibles, co-payments, premiums, annual or lifetime caps, and special and restricted access criteria, as anybody who's tried to obtain a drug through one of their provincial drug plans. This leads to variation in eligibility, variation in how much out-of-pocket expenses you have, what the coverage is, and the significant inequalities within provinces, being called a postal code lottery. And not surprisingly, there's much dissatisfaction with government drug plans. Next slide. I'm going to include a bit of data that's come out of Conference Board of Canada recently that just tells you something about the average time in each of these processes. As you can see, there's a substantial amount of time in Cadith. Manufacturers can apply to Cadith within 6 months of their anticipated approval from Health Canada, and you can see in 2020 that that was true, that there was an overlap there. That's changed in recent years, in the last 2 years. You'll also see that the time taken between Cadith recommendation and the PCPA starting to do negotiation has been increasing. And you can see also here in the green that the PCPA completion to the first listing can be quite short, that the yellow is the first listing to a 50% listing in provinces. And you could see that that's quite expensive. And we're talking here about averages, so some take a long time, some don't. Next slide. And you can also see the differences in provinces. There's some differences in the average number of drugs, the number of drugs approved over that time period. But the blue bars are perhaps more important. The average number of days that it takes from PCPA conclusion to a product licensing agreement within the provinces range from 6 weeks or so in Quebec to well over 600 days in Prince Edward Island. So depends where you live, and you, as I said, there's a lot of variation. Next slide. Over the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of focus on the PMPRB. The federal government's been trying to drastically reduce drug prices. In fact, there have been 5 years of wasted as appeal. The courts have ruled most of the changes unconstitutional. As I said earlier, the work starts for the PMPRB once a new patented drug has been sold. So the timing of the start of the PMPRB's actions is variable because it really depends. The first sale could be somebody who's paying out of pocket. The first sale could be somebody who's been waiting to obtain the drug through a drug plan. For many years, the PMPRB compared the price that a company's charging in Canada with the 7 comparator countries you can see here, and the ceiling price is based on the product's uniqueness and the PMPRB's own assessment of the drug's therapeutic benefit, which I should emphasize isn't always consistent with other people's patients' views and other scientific views. Next slide. The PMPRB wanted to change and has in fact changed by taking out the 2 expensive countries, Switzerland and the USA, and adding in some lower price countries. You can see here Austria, Belgium, Japan, Netherlands, Norway, and Spain. And this is likely, and has done, reduce the prices by about 20%. If they'd instituted the other changes, the prices would have gone down much more dramatically. And in fact, there would have been a high disincentive for manufacturers to bring drugs to Canada. Next slide. So in 2019, the federal budget talked about national pharmacare and had 3 foundational elements. One was a national drug agency, which was at that time suggested a combination of the health technology agencies, the PCPA, and maybe a part of Health Canada. That's changed recently, and we could talk a bit more about what the CDA will be. It talked about developing a comprehensive evidence-based national drug formulary. Currently, that appears to be a small list of so-called essential medications, of which drugs for rare disorders don't really seem to appear on that list, and a national strategy for high-cost medicines for rare disorders. And they offered at that point $5 million per year for 2 years. That's been extended to 3 years, and it's subject to bilateral agreements with each province and territory. We've seen the plan signed with 3 provinces to date, and probably John knows more about that than indeed I do. Next slide. This slide just is to talk about the impact of the issue around the PMPRB. The black line is all medicine, so you can see that there was fairly consistently 80 or so % of medicines came to Canada for drugs approved in the FDA and the EMA, but there's been a significant drop-off in the subsequent years because of concerns about pricing, about the PMPRB, and other issues. This has also impacted drugs with orphan status in the FDA or the EMA. We don't have orphan status in Canada, but you can see that the drop there is also relatively consistent. So I'm going to just finish by a final slide. Next slide, please, with some final thoughts. We have no Orphan Drug Act in Canada, unlike the USA, Europe, Japan, and several other countries. We don't, in fact, have a definition of what is a rare disorder, so we currently have no proper rare disorder strategy. We're taking baby steps on a strategy. Fewer DRDs, drugs for rare disorders, come to Canada. They're generally slower through the processes, and indeed, one of the points is that listing the drug might be listed in some way in a public drug plan, but it doesn't mean that access is straightforward, or indeed there's any access. So in Canada today, patients don't get new drug from a public plan until every 2 years crossed, every I is dotted, and that particularly applies to drugs for rare disorders. That's really the end of my slides, maybe more of a discussion now.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and thank you very much for that, Nigel. For those of us in the policy world, I think you've laid out the sort of additionally the thicket of acronyms that a lot of us have to deal with, and I think you've clarified that the nature of a lot of the organizations and how they interact with each other. One term that I was hoping you'd be able to define for the lay people joining us on the webinar is the idea of orphan drugs. What are orphan drugs, and what sort of policy is Canada lacking with respect to them?
Well, in Europe and the US, there's formal orphan drug status policies. Drugs, they have incentives for those, so that they can have lower fees in certain stages of the development and the regulatory and approval processes. They have incentives in terms of the amount of patent time, for example, and protections that they have, and a number of other benefits. Orphan status also, it'll include drugs for rare disorders, but it depends on your definition of a drug for rare disorders. So, for example, orphan status in the United States will include drugs for uncommon disorders like malaria and stuff like that. And we've seen more and more where, following the sequencing of the human genome, that some diseases, for example, lung cancer, is not just one disease, but a set of diseases depending on the genetic mutation. So you can, in fact, divide up lung cancer into a series of smaller genetic-induced versions of lung cancer. And so there are small numbers in those groups, and they can also obtain orphan status in the United States. It's more stringent, maybe, or more difficult to obtain it in the EU. Can't really speak about Australia and Japan, but it depends. So you can have a drug that has orphan status, but it wouldn't necessarily come under a formal definition of what we commonly think of as rare diseases, such as PKU, which John is very familiar with, some of the, for cystic fibrosis, for example, sickle cell disease, and some of the, the other rare disorders. Does that help?
Mr. Moderator, if I may chime in, I want the big picture for me from 40,000 feet is that the U.S. Congress passed the world's first Orphan Drug Act back in 1982. It was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. It reduced barriers and created incentives for scientists and investors to make large bets in small markets. What do I mean about small markets? Well, using the most common definition of what's rare, it's 1 in 2,000 patients or fewer. There are approximately 11,000 different known rare disorders, more to be discovered. But the problem from a patient point of view is unmet need. There are, of those 11,000 rare disorders, there are only 500 that have effective therapies other than merely symptom relief or palliative care. But actually, drugs, interventions that change the course of the disease and improve the health outcomes. So there's a huge unmet need. in the rare and ultra rare communities. And Canada's not a place, by not having an Orphan Drug Act, by not reducing the barriers, by not creating incentives for our scientists and developers to make the bets on small markets, then we're not in the game as effectively as we could be. And, you know, what the result of this fragmentation and the balkanization of healthcare in Canada for rare, as I call it, is that we have, as the immediate past federal minister of health said it so aptly back in March of 2022, we have a postal code lottery in terms of patient access to drugs. We have a postal code lottery in terms of access to diagnoses, and we have a postal code lottery in terms of access to non-drug therapies that are also regulated by Health Canada in different ways. Right? So to me, the big problem for Canadians is the postal code lottery, what's covered where, who, and how difficult is it? You know, and I'll use a tangible example. I have a son with the rare disease known as PKU, or phenylketonuria. It's not life-threatening, it's only brain-threatening. It's one of the many different possible causes of old language, mental retardation, new language, intellectual disability, and other neurologic complications. We've had a really good outcome. My son volunteered for a pivotal clinical trial for the first drug therapy. He had to go to Chicago because the trial was not available in Canada. And in 2 days, we knew that the drug was making a big difference. It absolutely transformed his brain function. Struggling C's in university became straight A's. It absolutely transformed his life and his career and all of that. And that drug was approved by the FDA. It's an orphan drug. It was approved by a small company out of California. They took that rare disease seriously. They made a big bet on a small market, and it was approved by the FDA in 2007. It was approved in Europe the next year, 2008. They got to Canada. It was approved in Canada in 2010. And what is this? This is the year 2024. Went through all the hoops of all the processes, and today there are still 3 or 4 provinces, Alberta, Manitoba, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, and Labrador, are you listening, who are not covering it, even though it passed all the hurdles along the way. All right. And that same drug company submitted a second drug for this rare disease, PKU. It was approved by the FDA in 2019, approved in Europe in 2020. It was approved by Health Canada in 2022, almost 2 years ago. And they're still waiting to decide whether or not they're going to bring it to Canada because of the problems in the system and because of the problems with getting the first drug to patients wall to wall across Canada. And I will just say, one of the incredible inefficiencies in our system, we're a small country, we're a wealthy country. We don't need to redo the regulatory reviews that are done with more resources in the United States by their FDA or with more resources by the European Medicines Association. For that drug that's pending for PKU in Canada that has been approved, the submission was 10 million pages. If you've printed it out, it would weigh more than 8 fully grown African elephants. And there was some new stuff because 2 years had gone by, but most of it was old stuff that every page had been reviewed by a team in Europe. Every page had been reviewed by a team in the United States. Do we really need to have another team review every single page? All right. And that problem persists for every drug coming to Canada, whether it's rare or non-rare, that the redundant reviews by the Health Canada system. So it's not a nimble regulator, and with respect, it's not a world-class regulator yet. And our solution is say, okay, bring me 2 approvals from trusted regulators, the FDA and the EMA, Australia, Switzerland, UK. Bring me 2 out of those 5, and you get and tell us, is there anything new, all right, that we need to take a look at that the other guys haven't already taken looks at, and then you have you get the go signal. The fundamental problem with our system is that we do everything from scratch, even though it's already been done by others elsewhere, trusted regulators, quality regulators, and we have some nuances for that first drug for PKU. We're the only regulator in the world that said you can use the drug when a woman is pregnant and carrying a baby. You can use the drug in that pregnancy for every day of the 9 months, but you don't have any data on whether or not the drug is safe on the day of delivery. So the actual Health Canada approval for that drug is unique in the world, because it says don't use it on the day you deliver your baby, even though you could have used it every day for the previous 9 months during the development of that fetus. All right, that's like, we don't need that bullshit. I'm sorry, that was an impolite term. All right.
The scientifically accurate term, I believe, John. No, but thank you for that. I think that I mean, you've illustrated very nicely with a very personal example, which thankfully is a positive story, and it's very good news that your son had the ability to go outside the country to access this. But I think the reality is there's a lot of other stories that don't end so well, precisely because people don't have those. And so, I mean, a lot of different things we could get into here, and I want to talk later, because you brought up equity and the sort of postal code lottery, and I think in a little bit we can get into the discussion around pharmacare, which I think in principle is this idea that we want to reduce barriers. We want to ensure that all Canadians have access to care. But I want to come back to what you've just said about Canada's resources, right, and reinventing the wheel. It seems to me, and I welcome both your thoughts on this. I mean, Canada is at a bit of a structural disadvantage. We're a much smaller country than the United States or Europe, so we just don't have the resources to do these things from scratch, even if we wanted to. To play devil's advocate, I think there are some people that would worry, about sort of outsourcing our regulatory. Is an issue of national sovereignty. Is it free riding as well? How would other countries feel about saying, you're not going to take the time or spend the energy to see if these drugs are safe? You're just going to lean on us. Would our international partners react well to that? So what do you gentlemen say to that?
Well, I mean, Health Canada's been talking for years about collaboration with other countries, regulatory bodies. In fact, they've done some of that. But they've done what seems to me to be a series of pilot studies or tests or run-throughs, and the other countries don't seem to be against it. I mean, it just seems to be that I think Monica Beijing said many years ago that Canada's a nation of pilot studies, but then doesn't carry through. So I've been in Canada for over 30 years, and when I first came, there was early years there was talking about collaboration with other agencies, and that's been going on for years, but we don't seem to sort of accept those. We seem to be duplicating and seeing if they are the same of the outcome. I think it's time that we moved on. These are and as John said, used some of those other evaluations, and just took them and then said, as John said, well, what's new? So, I mean, if a drug's been used in the United States for a year or so, then there's probably some new information about real-world evidence. And so that's important to include. We need to look at that. So there may be some drug safety issues. Hopefully not, but we need to know about that. So those kind of things would be new. If there is a drug safety issue, then that's a negative. But if there is real-world evidence that shows strongly that the drug is beneficial in the real clinic, in the everyday clinical setting, then that's a benefit. That's a positive. So I think there's an aptitude or an interest, and the other countries are not against us using their evaluations. So I don't see that that's a particular problem. I think it's an ingrown Canadian problem with, it's not our evaluation. So and it's an evaluation, and they're not Canadians. They might be Americans or Europeans. But do they differ that widely? It's those sort of questions. Yes, I think there is the question about sovereignty, but maybe we should suck it up and learn to benefit patients rather than standing on the sovereignty issue.
Sure. John, any thoughts?
We're proud to be slow and in Canada, and unfortunately, we're set up to be very complex. I think we actually, and the sin of our system is that every T has to be crossed and I dotted, as we said in the slide, in most cases, before a doctor can prescribe a drug and a patient can actually get it. All right. So, but I think part of the Canadian disease on process is way too much of this behind closed doors. If Canadians could actually, if the doors were opened and the windows were opened and the sunshine of public attention was opened up, I don't think Canadians would understand it, and they wouldn't stand for it when they saw it. During the pandemic, we saw the U.S. had advisory committees that met by Zoom in public, debating the pros and cons of various therapies, various vaccines, whatever your views on, that's a different topic. But you actually could read the materials if you were so inclined, and you could attend the meeting virtually. You couldn't speak, but you could hear the U.S. experts debating the ins and outs, and you could actually see how those expert advisory committees voted to recommend a vaccine or a drug up or down. And we need more sunshine and open doors and open forums. So, I used to be a Toronto City Councillor. People could come to City Hall and listen to the debates and committees, and they could make deputations at committees. I, as a citizen, I can go to a committee of the House of Commons or the Senate. I can go to a provincial legislature, and I may not be able to participate in the debate. I don't have a vote, but I can hear, did they get it? I can understand how they got to that position and that vote. Too much is taking place behind closed doors.
And that's not only Health Canada. I mean, that's the whole system.
Sure.
Yes, absolutely. And the other thing, out of full and fair disclosure here, I should add, I actually sit on two advisory committees to Health Canada. One is the Implementation Advisory Group to the Drugs for Rare Disorders. We've had 2 meetings, and I wish those meetings were open on Zoom or some other platform to everybody to have a chance to audit. And the other one is an advisory group, a multi-stakeholder steering committee on drug shortages. And that one works very effectively. The Drugs for Rare Disorders is still very much a slow-moving work in progress.
Right. And, I certainly take your point on the aversion to transparency, which extends well beyond healthcare, and governments in this country are very reluctant to share information with Canadians. We'll have to do another webinar on that topic, as I'm sure we could get a couple hours worth of discussion on that. I think, though, too, John, the point about speed, I think the traditional defense for taking your time is that, drugs are dangerous things and we don't want to inadvertently harm people. But of course, the flip side to that is there's a cost. That especially if, as you both pointed out, these are drugs that have been approved in other jurisdictions, and Canadians are waiting 3, 5, 10 years to be able to access them. There's a cost there. People can lose their lives in the meantime. So there is a trade-off involved, and I think we need to be open about that. Being slow and being careful is good, but if we're too slow and too careful, we actually do more damage on the other side.
Aaron, you may not know this, but I happen to be a widower. My wife died of 2 neurodegenerative diseases back in 2014. One is known as ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. The other is known as frontotemporal degeneration, or FTD. There were no therapies that would change the course of the disease back then. People with a diagnosis of ALS don't have 10 years or more to wait. Typically, from diagnosis to death is 3 years. In her case, it was 11 months. So with all due respect, I think the system has to put a little bit more trust in the ability of doctors and patients to say, I'm prepared to take the risk. I need help. I have a life-threatening condition, and I don't want to wait 3 years or 10 years or 14 years until every page is examined and every T is crossed and every I is dotted. I'll be dead. I have a friend who has cystic fibrosis. Several years ago, he defied the odds, but he'd come to pretty close to the end of the line. He was in the ICU, intensive care. He happens to be Roman Catholic. The priest had come and delivered the last rites. And one doctor said, there's one more thing we could try. There's this experimental drug. We have no idea if it's safe. We have no idea if it's effective, but it's a Hail Mary pass. And he's alive and well and practicing law and advocating for improved patient access because they were able to do that and get an exemption, and that drug is now approved. And he had the right genetic composition to respond to that innovative drug. And when you've had as a patient, when the priest has delivered the last rites, your tolerance for risk of trying something innovative is pretty high if you still have the will to live.
I think if I can add to that, I think that Health Canada, we shouldn't focus too much on Health Canada in terms of the amount of time it takes. It used to take much longer, believe me. It used to take an average of about 3 years. So it's now more consistent with the US and the EU. It could certainly learn to be better. And certainly, one of the issues is the drugs are not coming to Canada because we're not a top tier country. We're a relatively small population, and we have this complex system. But looking at health technology assessment and the PCPA, for example, if you look at their target timelines and add them up, that's about 430 days, so well over a year. And frankly, they don't achieve them. And so, and then we talk, in addition to that, we're talking about the amount of time that provinces, John and I have this phrase of slow walking them onto their formularies. So, patients don't have that time. It includes patients with rare disorders, it includes patients with cancer too. They don't have time. So, we have this complex system with these targets. And a target really, to me, a performance target means something you try to achieve, not that sort of you put up there and say, this is it. And we then go and forget all about it. So, first of all, we should have accountability in terms of, are they achieving their targets? Are they achieving what they should be doing? And then, we need the transparency in those stages. We also need the transparency in what are the provinces doing? And why does it take so long? What is the issue? If it's money, okay, but the residents should in fact know and should be transparent that we can't afford it, or we just don't believe that there are patients in our particular jurisdiction who need it. So it does take an awful lot of time, even once we've got Health Canada's approval.
Okay. I wanted to talk. Oh, sorry, John. Do you want to weigh in again?
We could take a page out of the book in some very faster moving jurisdictions. Germany has a program in drugs for rare disorders, orphan drugs, where they say the doctor, as soon as the regulator says it has a good safety profile, if there's a clinical benefit and there's quality manufacturing, as soon as the regulator says meets those three things, then the doctor can write the prescription and the patient can get the drug, while the other stuff about the health technology assessment, the cost effectiveness, the price negotiations take place. And there's a process where if it's not sorted out, and the drug company can charge what it likes, but at the end of the process of evaluation and price negotiations, the price goes back to day one. And there's even a process for independent third-party arbitration when the payers and the drug company can't agree on what the evidence suggests should be the value proposition. So they actually have you get to a resolution as opposed to an impasse. And it goes back to day one. So if you've overcharged, the drug company has to send a check for the difference. And if they've undercharged, then the payers have to send a check to the drug company. All right, so they've tried to have some balance and some checks and balances in the system, and they're not the only one. Other countries and jurisdictions are saying, we got a problem with how long the processes take. Let's look at ways and means of making it faster. If we have to take a leap of faith that we're reluctant to take. Saying, no, the most important thing is that the treating physician and the patient are willing to try, they want the drug now.
Right.
That should be the dynamic.
Right, that they're willing to accept the risk.
And all the other stuff, take it into the back room and sort it out.
I see.
All right?
Right,
But
right.
don't let it interfere with patient care.
Right. Yes. Putting patients first. What a novel principle in a healthcare system. You mentioned pricing, which is a nice pivot to my next question, because a lot of the discussion around drugs, and I know there's sort of specific considerations for drugs for rare disorders, but for drugs generally, it is very popular politically to promise lower drug prices. Especially with seniors. Nobody wants to pay more for drugs. Nobody wants to pay more for anything. So I guess I wanted to put it to the both of you as folks who watch, pay very close attention to this sector. What's wrong with wanting lower drug prices? What are some of the trade-offs involved when we drive prices down very low? Why shouldn't Canadians welcome lower drug prices? What are the things they're not being told about the consequences about when you drive drug prices down very low?
Do you want me to start, John? Well, I mean, first of all, you're not going to get investment in the country from pharmaceutical companies. And investment is a wide range. So you're not going to get trials. You're not going to get research. You're not going to get infrastructure. We've seen companies gradually backing away from Canada. If anybody who's driven from Montreal Airport down to downtown, you've seen those buildings used to be full of people working for pharmaceutical companies. A lot of them are empty now, and the same happens in Mississauga in Ontario. So they're going to back away. And you should remember in Canada that the big pharmaceutical companies here are all affiliates of global consortiums that are headquartered elsewhere. So, first, if you lower drug prices, then you lower the interest of companies in coming and bringing their medicines to Canada. They have a set list that they work through in where they're going to introduce their drugs. The United States is likely to be number one. Some of the Western European countries are going to be on there at number two, and we are somewhere in the middle. But we could certainly shift further down. It's that you're balancing. Do you want to have these beneficial medicines, or do you want to have older medicines at cheaper prices? There's a prime example in New Zealand about tightly controlled budgets. They have a different system to us, but you can see that the companies placed New Zealand well down the list simply because they have a tight budget control. They have trouble getting onto then they have a national formulary, their national formulary. So you can have lower drug prices, but then you can also you're also going to have slower access to new medicines.
I'm going to leap in and say the problem in rare diseases, the problem is unmet needs. That's the most dominant. We've had some successes, but mostly we have, of those 11,000 different known rare disorders, only 500 have disease-altering therapies. How are we going to make a difference? How are we going to get, it's a very big deal in rare when you can move a disease from untreatable to treatable. And now it's an even bigger deal when we're on the cusp of moving it to curable. All right. And is Canada going to play in this space? Is Canada going to be a player? Does it want to engage in this? Because we've had 40 years of the United States leading the world and making a difference, thanks to the Orphan Drug Act and some successor things that, again, have there's a filing fee to submit to Health Canada. There's a filing fee to submit to CADTH, et cetera. In orphan drugs, those filing fees are eliminated or hugely reduced. The EMA Europe has copycatted. Other jurisdictions have learned the lesson. It created a new industry in biotechnology to make large bets on small unmet needs. And we need to, we're passers-by watching the parade of medical and therapeutic innovation in too many cases, in too many ways. And this actually is an issue. One aspect of our national security is our health security. Yeah. And the fact that, the pandemic ought to have been a big wake-up call in so many ways, not just about where do you get personal protective equipment, where do you get vaccines, where do you get the therapeutics to fight COVID, et cetera. We are way too dependent, sitting on our oars, waiting for others to make the building blocks, waiting for others to put the drugs together or put the vaccines together. We need to have a rethink about our whole approach to meeting unmet therapeutic needs, and to have better health, a better quality of life, longer life, so that my son is working hard as a firefighter in Toronto, paying his taxes and contributing because of a miracle drug, right? So and those kinds of considerations are seldom, if ever, part of the deliberations at Health Canada, at the health technology assessment agencies, or in the drug price negotiations. What is this going to do? You can drive the price down so low that the supply basically goes away. And we've done that. There are 1,800 drugs on a watch list for drug shortages in Canada today. We have done if you drive the price down. Now, who wants to fly on a Boeing aircraft that was done by the lowest bidder? There need to be some checks and balances, and we want safe aviation. We want safe drugs, yes, but we also want to be able to make a difference in people's lives.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a lesson.
Balance right in Canada.
Yeah. It's a lesson that incentives do in fact matter, and that we can have low prices, but we should be surprised when we don't have access to certain drugs because there's no interest in anybody selling them here, because these companies can't make any money doing it. But you make another interesting point, John, which I think something a lot of Canadians may not often think about, is that we could be contributing rather than just if we created incentives here, we could have a robust sector which would not only be good for us economically and provide for health security, but we would be helping. We could be coming up with miracle drugs ourselves right here in Canada, and that would obviously save lives both here and around the world. So I think that's certainly food for thought.
We have some examples, great examples. Insulin is one of those, but that we contributed to the world. But yes, those examples are unfortunately too few and too far between.
Yes, and it's not we have a shortage of bright minds in this country to do it. What we do lack is a set of incentives to attract.
Let me give you one metric. Just the government funding for basic research. And we have the feds contribute significantly to a thing called the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. Mm-hmm. But its budget in round terms is about $2 billion a year. And those are Canadian dollars. Its sister organization in the United States is called the National Institutes of Health. Its budget is $45 billion a year, and those are not Canadian dollars. Those are US dollars. If the normal is a 10-to-1, we're doing 1/3 or less of what the U.S. government is doing to put in to create the bucks so that the basic science can be advanced. All right, we are riding in our health security. We should need to say thank you to American taxpayers, because some of their money goes to this knowledge factory called the National Institutes of Health. It's a world beater, and it did the basic science, and PKU did an excellent job as well. So I want to say thank you to any Americans who may be listening. Thank you for paying your federal taxes, because we outside of America are direct beneficiaries of your investment in basic science and research and development. And the biggest contributor to research and development in biotechnology and pharmacies in the United States is the private sector, Wall Street, and the companies. So they even do more than the U.S. federal government to make a difference, and we're free riding on that, with all due respect.
I noted, I'm just mindful of the time. We've got less than 10 minutes left, and I wanted to get to a couple of questions that people have submitted. And one, I think, is a broad topic that I wanted to touch on anyway, and that's the issue of pharmacare. I know, Nigel, in your slide presentation, you touched on, what the government has announced is coming. You also noted that there's a lot of dissatisfaction with existing government drug plans, which raises the question: if a lot of people are not happy with government plans as they are, is the right approach to essentially wipe out existing private plans and have a national pharmacare plan that everyone has to sign up for? So, would welcome both your thoughts on the idea, both in practice and in principle, of a national pharmacare program.
Well, I don't think they're ever going to wipe out the private insurance. I mean, I think that Canadians would be extremely annoyed unless they introduce something that is a platinum level plan for every Canadian, which would cost, I think, way too much. I don't think that they would put that money into it. Excuse me. So they're starting with basically what I can see is a fairly cheap program, and cheap is a relative term, with what they call essential drugs. And these are largely inexpensive drugs for what, as far as I can see, are common disorders. I think we probably would all agree that Canadians who have to choose between paying their rent or their electricity bill and their medications it's not appropriate. But they shouldn't be the sole focus of a national pharmacare system. It needs to be broader than that. The advisory council recommended starting that way, and to me the concern, as I mentioned earlier about pilot studies, the concern is that we start with that and we never get beyond it. I don't know which way they're going to go, but I don't think they're going to get rid of private plans. I think it'll be very difficult, but I think that one based on inexpensive drugs is a start. But I mean, it's not going to satisfy anybody as far as I can. It's very few people. Perhaps I should qualify that.
Some Canadians feel a sense of pride about having a universal health insurance system. I think the reality today is that the one thing that's universal about our healthcare system is everybody has to wait. Government-run, monopolized drug insurance scheme would be a recipe for even making the wait times for access to therapies worse than they are today. I think if we were really smart, we could look at the Netherlands for the lessons they've learned and the changes they've paid. They used to have a government drug insurance plan, and they realized that they were falling behind. They were losing the advantages of innovation. And they retooled it, and they said everybody must have health insurance, and the government will no longer be in a conflict of interest. The government will make the rules, but the government will not be a player in the insurance market. We will allow multiple players to compete. The government will define a minimum basket of what you have to offer, and then the private sector can compete with bells and whistles and add-ons and being efficiencies. And who's going to be the fastest to provide coverage for a new breakthrough drug for cystic fibrosis or ALS or whatever, or sickle cell disease or whatever it is. And that's really important. Our governments get in trouble when they try to be a player in the sport and the referee at the same time. All right. We need governments for a certain guardianship role, but that doesn't mean we need them for everything. And we need to actually rethink the mixed model. And maybe it's time for governments to take a step back, be the regulators, be good at being a regulator of the marketplace, but allow the marketplace to be effective.
Yes, wise words, John, and applicable to more sectors than this one, I would add. But I would venture to guess they have a bit of a different worldview than those of us on this panel. Gentlemen, we've got a couple of minutes left. I wanted to give both of you the last word, and I was hoping in particular, for the focus on drugs for rare disorders. In a realistic world, are there some changes that you would hope that the government might entertain, or that you have any sense they might be entertaining in the next year or two that would help those that are just waiting for the possibility of treatments?
Well, I'll leave it to John, really. I mean, I was just going to say that they have this so-called strategy. They have $1.5 billion. That's not going to get them very far. When you compare that with what they're putting into other things like the pharmacare and other things, it's I think we've described it someplace as chicken feed. Hopefully they're going to see that these drugs and these patients need greater support. The Canadian, I found, focuses on money spread around. This is not one of those situations. Just because a rare disease patient needs a drug that costs $250,000 a year doesn't mean they shouldn't get it because somebody else is not getting a share of that money. We need to look at what's the unmet, as John has said, what the unmet healthcare needs are, and then what would we do if that patient doesn't get that drug? They are losing out on a positive contributor to society, but they're also costing other parts of the health system probably quite a lot of money. You need to look at these wider issues. I see time is moving on, so I'll hand over to John.
Just to reinforce a point, the budget for the drugs for rare disease strategy is $500 million a year for 3 years. Put that in perspective, the federal budget expenditure is about $500 billion. So it's less than 1/10 of 1% of the total federal spend. There's at least a zero missing from the number for it to be truly effective. I would invite those who seek to be the next government of Canada after the next federal election to consider putting in an orphan drug act as part of their political program, and that would make a huge difference as well. It's not just the budget for spending; it's also the rules and regulations and the incentives and the barriers. So
that's great. Very, very helpful and very, very interesting. I want to thank you both, John, Nigel, for joining us today. And I want to thank you, the audience, for taking the time. And we will see you on the next webinar.
Okay.